guys mostly know Jeff Actor since he was our past president. Who? He's a yes, the most famous actor in our congregation. No, not really. Not really. Lori's pretty famous too. Yeah, he was a tenured professor at the University of Texas in Houston in, in biomedical science and immunology. And he's going to give us a series of lectures about genetics and are there Jewish genes. And today he was going to talk about genetically engineered foods. I now remember I asked him this question, so and he told me it's an hour lecture, so I'm really happy to be here.
All right, so first of all, Sarah, thank you very much for the gracious invitation. I appreciate it. My name is, I know most of you, but those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Actor, and it's an honor actually to be here and have some fun with you tonight. We're going to cover during the 3 independent lectures a series of links between Jewish ethics, Jewish law, and molecular biology, if you will. We'll keep the molecular biology to the light part of it, and we'll try to engage in some of the Jewish ethics a little deeper. The 3 sessions themselves are independent, as I mentioned. The first one's on food. The one on next Thursday, on April 11th, will be more on the use of molecular biology in medicines and creation of new technologies for health. And then on the 18th, we're going to cover a topic which I love, and that's cloning. And we'll look at the Jewish ethics behind cloning. Now, just one more, if you will, housekeeping function, not housekeeping gene, but housekeeping function. Those of you who are watching online from YouTube, welcome. I would recommend highly that you go to the CBS website and you download the PDF file that is the handout that we'll be following today. It's more complete than the PowerPoint slide. You can easily access that by going to the Congregation B'rith Shalom website. There is a pull-down menu. I believe it's under the topic of Learn. You then choose Adult Education, and you will see that the PDF is available for download. All right, are we ready? All right, so today we're going to talk then about Jewish genes, and genetic engineering has been near and dear to me for quite some time. But so has holidays. And really there are 2 types of holidays when we talk about Jewish tradition and Jewish religion. Holidays like Sukkot, where God created us, he gave us a world of food. Thank you, God, let's eat. And then there are the other types of holidays like Pesach and Hanukkah, where they tried to kill us, but we survived, great, let's eat. So no matter what, we know that Jews like to eat. But what are we as Jews eating? And does modern food technology allow us to live in accordance with Jewish laws and values? So today, I'm going to go through a number of concepts. First, we're going to put some of the applicable laws into a foundation that we can use to build upon to look at molecular biology and whether it is a yes or no for Jewish law. We're going to give some examples. We're going to look into grafting. I'm going to use the etrog as one of our examples because that will allow us to see on a macro scale what we will then introduce in genetic engineering on a micro scale. We're then going to get into some of the specifics and mechanics of genetic engineering, and then talk about why even have genetically modified organisms. Some of the pros and cons. We'll look then at what the current status is in Jewish law halakhically for those who are Orthodox or Reform. We'll look at Israel and what Israeli law says for use of genetically modified organisms. And we're also going to look at other religions, just briefly to see the comparison. Finally, I'll leave you with some additional thoughts, and we can open up a greater dialogue. So let's begin with a basic question. And our overarching question is, in the context of food production, does the artificial transfer of material between species that's naturally prevented from crossbreeding constitute a violation of halakha, of Jewish law, even if both species are kosher themselves? So we have to look at the ethics of the building blocks of God's world, and this really boils down to two independent classes. One is, what's the ethics of manipulating the building blocks of God's world, and then the importance of individual species. And we'll see that it really is a balance between stewardship and something called limenehu, which we're going to look at in a moment. So let's start with the ethics of manipulating the building blocks of God's world. And if we can have, Leslie, if you could see it. If not, it's on page 2 of your handout. Yeah, go ahead and read some of the verses from Genesis.
God said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Kivshua from Genesis 1:28. Subdue it.
God said, "Behold, I have given you all the herbs yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree that yields fruit. They shall be your food." Genesis.
They shall be yours. Subdue it, yours, and go ahead and Beverly, if you would, read that final one.
The heavens are God's creation, but their earth was given to humankind.
The heavens are God's, but the earth belongs to us. What do we have here? We have elements of what we call stewardship. God did the creation, but did he hand it over to man? I don't know. There's a balancing act, if you will, in Genesis that looks at it from another point of view. And this is the importance of individual species, or limenehu. This is something that comes up repeatedly, actually, in this week's Torah portion. It's according to its kind. It's a theme that runs all throughout Genesis. Humanity and other distinct species are celebrated throughout creation and throughout the Noah story. If you could, Martin, go ahead and read that next one.
Is it here?
It is. It's this one right here.
And the earth brought forth vegetation, herbs yielding seeds according to its kind, and trees yielding fruit, each containing seeds according to its kind.
According to its kind. They were separate. They were individual. On grafting, Hashem created species in the worlds of all animals, plants, and creatures of movement. He gave them the ability to exist as independent species. Go ahead, why don't you take this one right here. Sefer HaChinuch.
Sefer HaChinuch writes on the prohibition of mixing species, and all that God did is intended for the perfection of that which is needed in his world, and the species should not be mixed, lest it detract from the perfection and there will not be blessing.
Thank you. So what do we have here? We have Genesis, which starts off pretty straightforward, saying that we're stewards, we've been given this whole world. Uh-oh. But then it continues that we have guidelines with which we have to follow in taking care of that world. So that these two are not necessarily opposed to each other, but certainly in a balance between them. Now, it goes on in the Torah and in law to describe two very specific outcomes of that balance. One of them is a very specific law, and that's kilayim. That's the forbidden mixture. And along with that came another law, and that is shatness of crossbreeding. So there's a basic difference between, if you will, a natural selection process and that which is manipulated by man. Yes, you're allowed to take a species such as sheep and crossbreed the sheep that already exist, but you can't cross a sheep with another animal, another species. Think about it with the horse and the mule and the donkey, in that that is not permitted, even though they are closely related species. So that deliberate manipulation between dissimilar species that would never occur on its own is not allowed. Now, this all stems from a specific verse, and that verse is from Leviticus 19:19. Go ahead, Sarah, and read that for us.
Don't crossbreed your animals with other species. Do not plant your fields with different species. You shall not let your cattle mate with different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed.
Okay, so if we think about animals, yeah, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? But when it comes to grains, when it comes to seed, when it comes to other food products like plants, it's not as easy for us to grasp intentionally. So that to sum up this part of the introduction then, what we have is a foundation that balances us as caretakers over creatures that have been placed on the earth by Hashem or have evolved through evolution. However, that stewardship is sort of balanced over the laws of mastery of the world. Now, there is an example that we can look at in which we all know about and we take for granted, and it is at odds with these rules, and that's grafting. Now, in modern agriculture, farmers know that if you mix different fruit trees, parts of the trees, you end up with a sturdier fruit, whether that fruit is just longer lasting, easier to pick, disease resistant. It's a crossbreeding. And what you have is you can think of even the same type of tree, apples to apples, grafting one apple branch onto an existing apple tree. Well, that's the same species, that's okay. But if you look at, say, a lemon tree, where you take a lemon tree as a rootstock, and now you graft onto it something different, like an etrog tree, you start to run into complications. The example then of the etrog leads us to ask the question, if the etrog is kosher. And there are a couple different lines, and these come from Nachmanides. In grafting, it says, Hashem created species in the world of all animals, plants, creatures of movement, and gave them the ability to reproduce as long as Hashem wills it and the world to existence. But one who grafts plant species, it's as if one has denied the Holy One's blessing for a perfect world. And Nachmanides said the actions of combining species is disgusting and void. Let's take a closer look at the etrog in the example that it represents. And in this case, we're going to look at an etrog, something we use on Sukkot. And the etrog now has been grafted onto a rootstock of a lemon tree. So we have a couple choices. Is this really something that is disqualified? Or is this something that has a leniency, therefore, in some way that could be acceptable for us to, say, mass produce etrogim so that we can fulfill the commandment on Sukkot of using that etrog? So the first choice is, it's grafting. Let's disqualify it because we don't even know what grows afterwards, whether it's going to be a true etrog or whether it's going to be a lemon. Who knows? We also don't know that if we have that etrog branch and it produces flowers, that there might not be cross-pollination between flowers from the lemon and flowers from the etrog. And not that that cross-pollination might not occur normally in nature, but it does raise a problem. If that happens, is it a unique species? And how are we to know? Jewish law has looked at this, or rather it's in the Mishnah, the Gemara, in the Talmud. What it has said is that, well, if it looks like an etrog, what you can do is you can subtract the theoretical portion that would be a lemon. So what you do is you take the etrog and you weigh it, and you take the lemon and weigh it. You subtract the two, and what you're left with is the portion of the etrog that would be halakhically okay. Now, there's a caveat with that, and they probably came up with a solution because in the olden days when they thought about it, the etrog wasn't that much bigger than the lemon itself. And indeed, the etrog has to be a certain size for it to be valid halakhically for use at Sukkot. So, although it doesn't completely disqualify it, it does rule out that particular explanation. The other one is just a simple, let's render this unkosher based on kilayim, in that it doesn't take into, in the kilayim, in that it's that crossbreeding, it's that interbreeding between species, let's just rule it out. But molecularly, we know that there's a problem with this. And the problem with this is due to the fact that modern farming techniques are quite different than they used to be in ancient times. Now we know that a rootstock is just the portion at the very bottom. Indeed, what we graft on, that etrog portion, is only going to yield an etrog. And we know that genetically, there is no contribution from the lemon rootstock that gets into the etrog. Indeed, genetically, it is 100% pure etrog. So the choice number 2, even though it's based on halakha, doesn't actually make sense in today's world. So what we're left with is a conundrum. So the question is it kosher? So there is a ruling on that. Thank you, Leslie. That's an interesting question. According to what I've presented then, it seems pretty clear-cut that the Mishnah and the discussion really prohibits this type of plant grafting. But what it doesn't say is that there's any prohibition against using the fruit. So although the rules apply to the farmer, they don't necessarily apply to the consumer. Indeed, Jews can use and consume a hybrid species or product, and it's readily permissible now to consume the fruit in a grafted tree. Okay, everybody with me on that macro scale? All right, so let's now turn our attention back to the micro scale. Leslie.
Quick question. If you save the esrog from the holiday, and people will sometimes make a jam out of it, any sense of kashrut, whether that esrog jam is kosher?
Excellent question. The fruit itself is considered kosher to use, and therefore an etrog jam would be acceptable and valid and kosher to spread on your matzah, which we'll get to a case for Pesach in a little bit. So let's turn our attention now to genetic engineering. And that is a practice where we alter the genetic blueprints of plants or animals to create new varieties of foods and seeds. Genetically modified organisms, GMOs, or genetically modified foods, are those that have their DNA different from the original one. Indeed, what we do is we introduce DNA from another organism into the cells of those plants or animals. Now, you're probably wondering how much of this actually affects you, even on a day-to-day basis. Well, in the United States, as of the last figures of about 2 years ago, over 180 million acres of genetic engineering crops are cultivated. The FDA has approved 13 major crops for use, for growth, and distribution in the United States. Species such as corn, soybeans, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, papaya, potatoes, even summer squash. In the year 2020, GMO soybeans made up 94% of all soybeans. Cotton was 96%, 92% corn. Canola was over 95% of all the oil, contributing to all the oil that's produced. And get this, if you ever looked at the label on any of the packaging and seen sugar, not corn syrup, but sugar, that sugar likely comes from sugar beets. Sugar cane has kind of waned over the years. Sugar beets is now one of the major sources. Over 99.9% of all sugar beets comes from genetically modified beets. It's out there. Is it kosher? Let's look a little bit at the process. What we do is we take the genes from a non-related species. They could be any species. It could be an insect. It can be a plant. It can be a mammal. And what we do is we isolate that and we put it into plants. Now, anybody venture, why would we even want to do this? Seth? Resistance to pests. Very good. Anybody else? Make them stronger, more viable, more virulent, more growth hardy. Protection against weather, production. Also, storage to allow for shipping to larger areas from where it was produced. Okay. The other things that it's allowed to do is it's allowed to increase the speed at which the fruit or the plant matures, thus allowing better, quicker, more efficient growth. Okay, so we then covered potential to improve crop yields. Now, what we have is a molecular replacement or a molecular addition of nucleic acids that have been transferred from one species to another. This is probably okay when we're talking about two species that are both kosher, as long as it fits into some of the foundational laws that we covered before. But what happens if we take a gene that's been isolated from a non-kosher animal and put it into a kosher species? Now we got something that's a little more questionable, isn't it? I can give you an example. We're going to go through the example of grains, but the one example that I can think of off the top of my head is farmed salmon. Farmed salmon are grown in pens. We all eat farmed salmon. It's quite tasty. It's easier to grow. It's easier to bring to market. They also grow the salmon faster. And indeed, now, what they've done is they've taken the gene that allows accelerated growth in eels and put them into salmon. Now, I don't know how much of this is making it to market right now. I do know it's under research and in the pipeline, if you will. But that's an example where we took something from an unkosher animal and we put it into a kosher species. So let's take a closer look at the underlying mechanics here. What we're doing is we're just really taking a series of nucleic acids from one organism and putting it into the other. Well, that would be great if I had to take an eel or a pig and splice out the gene in every single cell and then splice it back into every single cell that's in the kosher organism. But that's not what's done. In the laboratory, we can isolate these genes and grow them, expand them, amplify them outside of the original organism. In fact, if we get the linear sequence of nucleic acids, the adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, we can molecularly have a computer put them together in the order we want. Now, technically, what's done is we take those copies and we usually put them into something like a bacteria that's easy to grow in a large vat. And we can amplify it again and again and again and again and again. Isolate it and put it into a single cell or a group of cells in a small growing plant. Hopefully we've put it in the right place in the plant grows up, and when the plant is fertilized and it gives off seed, those sequences have been incorporated into the seed. So now when we grow that, that is a stable lineage of the nucleic acids. But you can see it is extremely far removed molecularly from that original non-kosher animal. Is everybody with me so far? Any questions? Sure, Elizabeth? Question.
I'm worried about the eel in the water with the salmon. If I go into Whole Foods and go get some fresh salmon, and they'll tell you, this is farm done, or it's, from the ocean or whatever, am I safer to get the ocean one or get the farm one?
That's a question which I can give you an opinion on. The opinion is that there is no difference. And the FDA, although they haven't ruled on this, there is no difference. There's a difference in price. There's a difference in the speed at which it was grown. There is no harm at all from putting that gene into the fish. Now, you can't get these fish yet at Whole Foods. But I would think that in the relatively near future, this will be something that could be very commonplace. Okay, so to lead us on in the discussion and get us back, really the original gene served as a chemical template. And that gene is not placed in each and every cell of, say, a tomato, but rather in some of the seeds that produce new generations of plants that have never come into contact with that eel, with that other organism. Rather, it's now an independent associated line. Okay. So we have this process of copying and recopying. Let's take a look now at some of the Jewish law and what they have to say. All right. Okay, there's a concept called batul. Anybody heard this concept before? I see a couple heads shaking yes. Let's put it into perspective. What's batul? Well, it's when my mother was cooking up a huge vat of chicken soup Friday afternoon, getting ready for Shabbos, and my father snuck into the refrigerator, opened up some yogurt, popped the lid, and it splattered all over. Some of it splattered into the chicken soup. Does the chicken soup, now that it has milk in it, become non-kosher? Well, the wise minds of previous days understood this probably happens more often than not. And we can't throw out that whole vat of chicken soup. So the concept was, if something is so microscopic as to not change the nature of the invaded food item, we can consider it null and void. That's batul, nullified. And they said that if this is less than 1/60th of what it's added to, then clearly it is nullified. So if we were to take that halakhic excuse for a non-kosher additive that allows it to be less than 1 part in a 60th, you would think it would be okay. This workaround, this batul, might work. Maybe it's too small to matter, but there was an exception to the chicken soup batul. If it changes the taste, the consistency, or the nature of what it was added to, then that no longer matters if it's less than 1/60th. So not only does it have to be accidental, but it has to be something which does not change the composition. Well, you know where this is going, don't you? By definition, we're taking something that may be less than 1/60th. In fact, it is. It's been diluted again and again and again and again. But we've specifically done it to change the nature of the original beast, if you will. So batul does not hold up in our argument.
Isn't, when you actually splice genes in, you're doing it intentionally. It's not an accident. That would also disqualify it.
Exactly. You've done it on purpose. Even if it was the technician and you were in another room, this is something that is clearly not allowed. Okay, so batul doesn't work for us. So it may be unreasonable to consider the implantation of non-kosher genes as purely the microscopic phenomena. Okay, so let's look at a couple other indicators and problems. What is the implication of eating an animal that's been fed GMO crops? Interesting question. We all know cattle need grain, corn, to grow. And I just told you that 94, 95, 96% of all of that GMO product is out there, so they've probably eaten it. Actually, they've ruled that there's no difference between GMO and non-GMO foods that affects the health and safety of animals. So the DNA in the GMO food does not transfer to the animal. Rather, it's broken down in their gut, and those proteins from the modified organisms are then utilized by the cow to grow. So this becomes okay to feed our cattle, to feed our animals that non-GMO, that GMO food. Okay, now here's a good one because Shabbos, Pesach is coming up. Matzah. Gosh, whoever thought that matzah would have genetically modified wheat? Wow, have I been eating matzah that's not kosher? Well, it turns out that it wasn't until 2015 that Manischewitz got on board with this whole political incited GMO, non-GMO revolution. And since 2015, Manischewitz announced a line of, and now I believe almost all of their matzah, you'll have to look at the box, Horowitz, Margaretin, Manischewitz, all of them have made with non-GMO wheat. It gets to be quite expensive to use that wheat. However, they've done that in sort of a working around to this. But they freely admit before 2015, this wasn't even a question. Of course the matzah was kosher for Pesach. Of course you could use it. It was only when there was political pressure that they changed. Now you may ask, okay, I've got gluten sensitivity. I'm a celiac. What can I say? wouldn't it be great if they can make a matzah for me that doesn't contain gluten? Then it would allow me to fulfill the commandment of eating matzah on Pesach. Interesting. However, when you think about it, the gluten is really what makes the matzah leaven. So in this case, it's that bubble formed in the dough, which is held by the structure and the elasticity of the gluten. So if I took out the gluten, the matzah wouldn't even be able to rise. So therefore, it doesn't fill the heartfelt, the neshama behind the matzah for the Pesach. So it would just be a cracker, and that wouldn't be any good. Okay, so let's look at the takeaway concept from there. It may be unreasonable to consider the implantation of non-kosher genes as purely microscopic phenomenon without ignoring the macroscopic and the observable effects that they produce. Okay, everybody with me? So let's now turn our attention to the current rulings and standards and standings for, let's start with Judaism and Orthodox rulings and Reform rulings. If we look at the Orthodox Union, they ruled that genetic engineering does not affect the kosher status because, and their major point was, the genetic material is microscopic. Now, for those of you who have downloaded the handout, I have a link to the actual ruling, and you can look at it in more detail. They said while the blending of species, the kilayim, is certainly a valid point, it was determined that this only prohibits a complete hybridization between two species, and not just that single gene. So it's not directly related to enhancement of one particular species by adding just that microscopic portion which is diluted out. So Orthodox Union says, yes, it's okay. They also said, while it's not a virtue to tamper with nature, it is prohibited. So they could, sorry, it's not prohibited. Thank you, Sam. Okay. That's the Orthodox Union. If we look at the responsa for the Reform Central Conference of American Rabbis, they focused it on a more narrow question with a specific modified food. And they said that the use is valid because the contribution adds to the global world. Indeed, they found that being able to make more food cheaper, faster, more efficiently, and allow it to get to where it was going was a greater good for the entire world than any of the prohibitions or laws take away from that concept. So in both cases, what we have is really an allowance for eating of the genetically modified organisms. Okay. Interesting. I also looked into Israeli law. Israeli law was kind of unique and threw me for a loop here. What it does is it permits the development and growth of the organisms for research in a way that is in accordance with the established law. However, although GMO growth is not permitted, they said you can use it for research, but you can't use it for growth. So you can't grow the genetically modified organisms for consumer use in Israel. So it was kind of a caveat. My guess is they had some pushback in the Knesset at the time, and they came to sort of a balance between it's okay to develop it, but it's not okay to grow it for commercial purposes. But with that said, if you have genetically modified organisms, say wheat, coming in from the outside, it's okay to be used, as long as it wasn't grown in Israel. could be developed in Israel, it can be grown in the United States, it could be shipped back to Israel, and it would be okay. That's where Israel stands right now. Let's take a look at two other religions just real quickly. The first is looking at Muslims. Originally, they said there's no need for genetic modification because God created everything perfectly. And man does not have the right to manipulate anything that God used in his divine wisdom. However, they've now come to a different conclusion, and the Islamic Jurisprudence Council, more recently, within the last decade, said foods derived from biotechnology-improved crops are indeed halal and fit for consumptions by Muslims. So their original stance was actually changed after all the scientific information that was understood. Looking at Christianity, in 2009, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which is the Vatican's top science body, issued a statement in support of this technology as long as it was used properly, appropriately, responsibly. So in some readings I've seen they endorse it. In others they see that it's acceptable without the full endorsement. Okay. Everybody still with me? All right, I got just one or two more things that I want to share with you about this. And that is some other ethical considerations. And almost every ruling on this issue comes with caveats. And of course, the Jewish stance and the ethics behind that, balanced against the law, insist that we consider some other factors in the production, the growth, the use, the consumption, etc. Some of these are that we have to be aware of the environment. Is there an environmental impact because we've modified the plant or the animal? Will a toxin be produced, or will it lead to denigration of another crop that is growing nearby? Something that unfortunately happened early on, in which the modified plant had a pollen which affected bees and ended up to killing of thousands of bees in the local area. This has since been changed. They know to look for those types of incidents before they grow it up. The other thing is that sometimes companies will develop these organisms, these plants, so that their seeds are what we call terminator seeds. It's really a one-time planting of a seed, so that the fruit of the plant, if you will, the seed cannot be used to grow the next round. Sort of like a poison plant, if you will, for that seed, for that plant not to be replanted again and again. So this in itself appears to be in contradiction with Genesis 1:29 that states, God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit shall be yours for food." And this terminator seed, if you will, does not allow the fulfillment of what's inherent in that verse. Okay, a couple other questions I just want you to think about on your own. We have to be careful and consider the ethics behind why is the GMO produced. Is it just for profit? Or is it a way to allow more people to be fed? Who benefits? Who profits? We talked about detrimental side effects, animals, but we also have to talk about consumer safety. And that's something the FDA takes a close look at here in the United States. Along with that, there's a bigger question that needs to be discussed, and that is, how does it affect biodiversity? We all know that corn, if you look in the 1800s, every little area had its own strain, if you will, of corn. In fact, the Native Americans used to have corn that only grew in certain types of climates. Well, now, because corn grown over the United States has been basically modified to such a degree and such an extent, we're beginning to lose the biodiversity in that corn. Is this ethically correct? I can't answer that, but it is a question that needs to be raised. And then finally, we have to realize that whenever we do this, we have to make sure to treat the food supply with respect. This is a plant. We'll talk later on next time about modified animals. These are animals. And always you have to treat them with respect. Okay. So then finally I'm going to leave you with just this fun page. And that is there a specific gene that makes food kosher? We could take a gene from here and put it into there. But wouldn't it be great if there were a gene, maybe dating back to Abraham or Moshe, that we could find? Well, the priestly gene, the Kohen gene, put it into a plant, automatically make it kosher. Another question, let's take a look. A carp. What if it's genetically engineered so it doesn't have scales? Is it still kosher? If a catfish is genetically engineered so that it has scales, can we now go noodling and eat catfish? Clone food, and this is something that hits home because it's recently been done. What if we were to take meat, it can be pork, it can be any meat, and grow it in a vat? An argument can be made that it's possibly okay because it reduces animal suffering. But is that still pork? Is it non-kosher? Or is it something new? Would it have lost its non-kosher identity? How about, is there any time when a Jew is obligated to eat one of these genetically engineered foods? I can think of a couple off the top of my head. Rice has been genetically engineered to allow a certain vitamin to be more prevalent. Feed it to children. They don't go blind as quickly when they're malnourished. Would this be an obligation to use that for their health? And then, should there be adequate labeling of products so that vegetarians avoid eating vegetables that have been engineered with an animal gene? I don't know. So in summary, we can put this all together. Although a number of mainstream groups have ruled that genetic engineered foods are indeed kosher due to the microscopic nature, there are still some religious objections that persist. And most of those seem to surround the essential nature and the changing of the organism. So our overall debate boils down to either taking care of the natural world and respecting its integrity and not playing God, versus mastery over the world and what we started with, in that we should master the world and subdue it. So I hope you'll use this presentation as a stepping stone. Open up a dialogue with your clergy, ask questions, and determine what your synagogue, your place of worship, what you should do relative to genetic modifications. Thank you. Questions? Sarah?
Has the conservative movement produced a response to this? No.
No, the conservative movement kind of went with the flow, and they've supported the rationales of the Orthodox ruling. Marge?
Hi. Over the years, people have gotten sensitive to certain foods and developed allergies and negative responses. So the genetically modified food, I think, opens up more of a opportunity for people to have a variety of foods.
Interesting, thank you. I'm certainly not here to advocate politically one direction or another. It has seemed to me that some of the foods no longer contain all of the scope of allergens that they would have seen in previous years, because we're using a slightly different strain of wheat, of corn, of beets, of all of those, so we're not exposed to that. Any other questions? Elizabeth.
When you talked about grafting, you said an etrog grafted onto a lemon tree remains 100% an etrog. Is that correct? So if you take one species of apple and graft it onto a different species of apple tree, isn't the graft still 100% the first kind of apple?
So what we're talking about is apples to apples versus apples to oranges. So apples to apples is okay. In fact, for all apples, apples don't, if you take the seed from an apple and you plant it and 30 years later you eventually get an apple, that apple is not identical to the original apple. In fact, the only way that we can have the Fujis, the crisps, etc., is through a grafting process to carry that particular apple type. So apples are considered the same species, whether they're slightly different in taste. Whereas an etrog and a lemon were considered two unique species that are clearly identifiable. So that's the difference between that question.
Can I go in a slightly different path? Yes. So there is a man alive today with a pig's kidney. And I guess it presents an obvious question.
So in the news, it was 2 weeks ago, I think now, maybe last week, an individual was planted with a genetically manipulated pig organ. I believe it was a kidney. It was a kidney, and this pig was actually bred to express on it markers that would permit less rejection from the human host. It was a serious breakthrough, and it allows the ability to have more available organs for humans who are waiting to receive them. We won't talk about the pig, but it is a genetically modified biologic medicine, if you will. Now, I don't want to spoil next week, but we're going to talk about that. But I can give you just one little clue that to save a human life, it is though you have saved the entire world. So from that perspective, there's definitely a positive component. Now, the ethics of manipulating an animal solely for use as something to be harvested for an organ, I leave it up to you to say if that's the same level as growing an animal to be used for food. And we can talk about that later. Any other questions?
Yes, when you mentioned the GMO giving us a single strain and eliminating biodiversity, isn't that also opening us up to something that might attack it and just wipe it all out?
I agree with what you're saying, is that if we're left with a major single species of, say, corn, and we have development of a virus, a fungus, a disease that attacks it, we are very susceptible to wiping out a large portion of crops. The developers have taken that into account, and they know about separation of fields. They know to closely watch so that it doesn't spread. But yeah, when you eliminate biodiversity, what you've done is you have eliminated some of that protection for overall species continuation on the earth.
So even without GMO technology, with conventional species farming techniques, we've done that to bananas.
And up until the genetic modification era, it's clear that we have been trying to breed and crossbreed similar species to get the traits that allow them to be hardier, to be more resistant. Some would argue that by using molecular biology, we've accelerated this pace much, much faster than we could have done in pre-GMO times.
What's an example of a terminator seed, and what's the purpose other than increasing profits?
I'm going to pick on a company, and actually this company has brilliant scientists. I know a number of my classmates that ended up at Monsanto. And they ended up Monsanto because they were really leading edge, cutting edge in molecular biology and transformation, putting genes into genetically modified wheat, corn, whatever it is, the seed. What Monsanto has done over the years is they saw that people would grow this and then either save the seed themselves to plant next year, thus saving on cost to the farmer, or they would save it and perhaps give it to their neighbor. Or there would be a crossbreeding of the genetics of one plant to a field a couple acres away. Thus, Monsanto would lose out on that other field as well. So by engineering the wheat so that the seed that was given at the end of harvest was non-viable if planted, it became a terminator. So yes, it had everything needed to grow healthy and strong, quickly, disease resistant. It just couldn't replicate, or it couldn't replicate easily. And in that case, it's a terminated line. So next year you'd have to buy seed from a company to plant your fields again. It's business.
So you're a scientist, and a lot of the biblical references are difficult to really interpret under modern science. What is a species? The definition of a kosher animal is pretty clear in the Bible. But I think where you're going is there are ethical considerations in doing genetically modified organisms. So my question to you, Jeff, is what is your when you think about it, what is your hierarchy of ethical considerations if somebody came to you with a proposal for a GMO activity of some kind?
That's a really loaded question, Sam. As a scientist, I really marvel at the ability to identify, manipulate, and design drugs to help humans in all aspects of life: food, health, safety. It's a tool in our toolbox a physician can use, a scientist can develop. I was in vaccine design for 3 decades. Now, what it would have taken me decades to do, we have AI computers that do it. I don't have to splice the gene, see if it works, test it. In fact, I can now use AI. It's another tool in the toolbox. Yeah, now if we look at, as Sam just said, the whole COVID vaccine was genetically engineered. It's another tool in the toolbox. So as a scientist, when I look at this, I marvel at the age of exploration that we are in. It's fascinating. But I also know that for every plus, there's also a bit of negative, whether it is the cost and it's not available to everybody, whether it is a dampening of the biodiversity in the world, that we know Hashem put that biodiversity here to evolve in a way that man can be a good steward. So we all wrestle with these ethical components of how far should we go? And unfortunately, sometimes the way to find out how far is to get there and then take a step back. Well, hopefully it's never too late to do that.
Back to COVID disease itself might have been genetically engineered.
Well, so one of the, I've read it and Sam just expressed it, and we don't have evidence to say it's true or it's not, but you can take in biowarfare genetic engineering of a virus and put it out there. And that's something that we have the capability to do, but we don't. Because we as humans should have the ethical understanding that although you think it might be limited use, it's not. You can't let that genie out. There are a number of organisms, actually, that have been eradicated from the earth. And one of the early experiments was to take the DNA sequence of one of those organisms and see if you could recreate it. And the answer was yes. And that was so scary that the scientific community wrote laws pledging not to do that. Now, it can be done by a rogue 007 scientist on some mad island. But I believe we are learning to put the ethics in place before or during the production rather than waiting until after. And scientists have the responsibility to participate in that. Thank you. All right, everybody, thank you for your attention, and have a great evening.